Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. So feel free to pour that third cup of coffee and we'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good to see you all here today for another webinar. As you may know by now, my name is Michael Ibrahim, and I am Program Manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. The Cultural Investment Portfolio's focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and we are excited to present today's webinar, Strategic Planning During COVID-19. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. This spring, we're offering 2 free workshops every Tuesday and Thursday in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, and board governance. Joining us today to deliver today's workshop are Sarah Glatt from Paper Crane Associates, Nikki Stewart from the Old North Foundation as a panelist, and Rebecca Wright from the Fitchburg Art Museum as a panelist. While we're going to get started in just a moment, I want to go over a few ground rules. Feel free to say hi in the chat. Just give us a little wave and say your organization, who you're representing today. Just kind of helps us know who's here. This session has automatic captioning. Auto-generated captions are provided on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you do need any additional accommodations to ensure your participation, just let us know when you register. If this is distracting for you, you can always hide this by clicking close in the closed captioning options, hide subtitles. We're going to have time for questions and answers throughout this presentation and this conversation. So we ask you to please use the Q&A function. It helps us keep everything organized and moving along. Not so much the chat, just the Q&A keeps us together for questions. As you may notice, the session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel probably tomorrow. You'll get an email from me when that is ready, and some additional materials that Sarah has created. My colleague, Sarah Glidden, is here, and she's giving some resources out in the chat. Thank you, Sarah, for doing that. This session is clocked in at 90 minutes, including time for questions. So with that in mind, I'd love to turn it over to Sarah Glatt.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm so glad that so many of you are able to join us today. My name is Sarah Glatt, and I run a consulting firm called Paper Crane Associates. And our work is focused on helping organizations at pivotal moments of change. We're going to be talking this afternoon about strategic planning, particularly about how strategic plans helped many organizations during COVID, the recession, and the pandemic, and how strategic plans and doing them can help you chart the path forward for your organization. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by 2 of your colleagues from the field to share some case studies directly from their work, and we'll turn to them in just a few minutes. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about our goals for today. Our goals for today are to understand how planning can guide decision-making in times of change and uncertainty, understand why success and failure of a strategic plan is based not on what is decided in the strategic planning process, but actually on how the process itself is set up from the get-go. Explore how strategic planning during the COVID pandemic and the recession is both different and better than what we were doing prior to these dual crises, and hear from 2 of our peers. about their experiences with strategic plans and the COVID recession. As Michael said, if you have questions, we'd love to hear them. The best way to put you to share questions with us is via the Q&A box. Okay. Oh, we're a little jumpy here. Okay, here we are. So COVID-19 has impacted many charities across the country, including your own, as you tried to pursue your mission and navigate through the COVID-19 economic crisis. When you registered for this workshop, we asked you to describe 2020 in one word for your organization. And here's what many of you wrote. You wrote words like chaotic and challenging, uncertain, roller coaster. And others of you wrote responsive, exciting, pivoting, resilient, and innovative. And we're going to talk a little bit about why some of you feel one way and why some of you felt so differently about 2020. So more than a year after the start of the pandemic, we're continuing to see many significant impacts. And as the impacts of many loan programs like the PPP start to fall away, we're starting to look at a future that looks perhaps different than what we saw in 2019. And that future can look both better and exciting for what we can do differently as a result of what COVID has provided us. But when we look at 2020, we see organizations have responded very differently. As I noted, some organizations pivoted, changed, and responded in real time to what was happening, while others struggled to find their path forward in a rapidly changing world. And we saw that in some of your responses into describing how 2020 looked for your organization. So how did organizations differ? What we've seen over and over is that for some organizations, their strategic plan was the cornerstone of every decision that they made in 2020. And that decision making was centered around their priorities, working from what they had identified as their reason for being as an organization, their theory of change. And maybe it required them to look different or to act differently. So the what they did or how they did it had to change, but the why they did it and their core priorities continued to be the guiding light, that North Star throughout their 2020 decision making. For other organizations, their strategic plan felt really irrelevant and decision making was being driven by other factors. It was being driven by worries, it was being driven by staffing, it was being driven by funder priorities and other money concerns. Having a strategic plan is an asset in any crisis. And when things are changing drastically or quickly, having a strategic plan in place can be that clarity in decision making. We see really strong organizations use their strategic plan every day to drive decision making. They use it in real time to say, how should I spend my time? How should I spend my money? What should I be focused on today, tomorrow, and next week? So we're going to start this afternoon by talking a little bit about what a strategic plan is and how and why to build one. And then we'll turn to one of our case studies to hear a little bit about how having a strategic plan helped them through COVID. So a strong strategic plan serves as a clearly articulated and compelling vision that really unites the organization and inspires the organization to move forward. It's the reason that everyone comes to work. It's the reason people join the board. It's the reason that funders and donors and partners join you in a coalition to try to make that theory of change come to fruition. A strategic plan provides a really concrete roadmap about how to spend your time, how to spend your money, how to allocate your team. And it provides a roadmap of if we follow these goals and accomplish these goals, then we know that we're going to achieve and accomplish the impact that we want, and that vision that we have for the future being different will come to fruition. The roadmap inside your strategic plan also provides a way to monitor progress, so that you know doing this and then this is going to lead you to where you want to be, and that this is going to unlock your ability to do that. That roadmap also provides an opportunity to make mid-course corrections. Of course, none of us in 2019 had foreseen COVID coming in the way that it did. And so the mid-course corrections that we were envisioning, many organizations we need to have were about things like staffing changes or board changes or funding changes or changing needs in the community or changing funding resources, or the ability to achieve things faster and now having additional resources to put towards moving a different goal forward faster. But that roadmap that's embedded in your strategic plan is that guides you every step of the way through the strategic plan and towards your big vision. The strategic plan also really clearly outlines the resources that you're going to need and make sure that when you get going on your strategic plan, that those resources are in place. And when we talk about resources, so quickly we think of money, but in the nonprofit sector, those resources are also our people. Our people are our greatest asset, our staff, our board, our volunteers, and we need to know from the beginning when we embark on a strategic plan that we have the money and people in place, or that we will definitely be able to get our hands on them in order to walk that roadmap to lead to that vision. On bumpy roads, which occur for every organization, and even in times outside of COVID, a strategic plan is really helpful. It helps us to stay focused on the most important thing. There are any number of things that are disguised as opportunities that show up in the form of a new grant opportunity, a partner asking you a question, a need that's emerging. But using your strategic plan allows you to stay focused on the things that you said were most important. The example I often give is to think about bowling. If you grew up here in New England like I did, we went bowling with bumpers in the gutters. That allowed us to, when we rolled our ball as little kids, to continue to make progress towards knocking down those pins, even if there was a little bit of wiggle or wobble when we threw the ball. And so the same thing happens in strategic planning and in implementing your strategic plan. Sometimes there are new things that we could never have envisioned would appear as opportunities. And having your strategic plan allows you to look at those opportunities and assess, is this something that is going to help us and support our progress towards our mission, our vision, our goals? Or is this thing something that's actually going to impede our progress, be a distraction from the things that are most important to us? Our strategic plan also helps us to know that if the going gets a little bit tough or a little bit bumpier than we might have thought, that our business model and capitalization structure can support and weather any changes that we need to make along the way. Organizations which thrive in times of uncertainty rely on their strategic plan to guide their every step. When you joined when you registered for the webinar this afternoon, we asked you if you had a strategic plan in place. And what you told us is that only about half of you had a strategic plan in place, and that only about half of those folks relied on their strategic plan as a valuable guide to decision making in COVID and the pandemic and the recession. And I think this is a really telling situation where many of the organizations in our sector do not have strategic plans, and even those who do are not using them to the best of their ability. And as we work to create better and stronger and more resilient organizations, having stronger and better strategic plans are going to help us as we navigate our way over the next couple of years out of COVID and the recession, but also for all of the bumpy roads that we may experience over the coming years. I'd like to turn for a moment to invite Rebecca Wright from the Fitchburg Art Museum to join us to talk a little bit about the Fitchburg Art Museum's strategic planning. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Nice to see you, and thanks for inviting me.
I'd love for you to take us back a little bit to the pre-COVID times, which feels to me somewhere about 3 million years ago, but I think might only be about 15 months ago. Could you tell us a little bit about where the Fitchburg Art Museum was at that time, and also introduce the Fitchburg Art Museum to some of your colleagues who might not know it? So what was, who was Fitchburg Art Museum 15 months ago, and what was it thinking, what did it have in place in terms of a strategic plan?
Sure, thanks. Well, first I'll just introduce myself and the museum. I'm the director of development at the Art Museum, and I've been there about 5 years. And I'm also kind of filling in for our director, Nick Capasso, who had hoped to be here and was unable to make it today. And he's been there about 8 years. And we are, for anyone who doesn't know, we're a mid-sized art museum in North Central Mass, really the largest cultural organization in North Central Mass. We're approaching our 100th anniversary. We were founded in the 20s, and we have a collection, obviously, collection strengths of American art, African art, and photography. And we have a big focus on our community, engaging with the community, being relevant to the community and accessible to the community. And we have a lot of community partnerships, and I'm sure I'll be talking about more of all of those as we go into the strategic planning story. But I guess for background, we had a strategic plan. We're big believers in strategic planning. And Nick, after he had been there a few years, without a strategic plan, I believe at first, decided it was time he was ready to set the course for the next 5 years. And they went through a very rigorous process to come up with a 5-year plan in 2016 that was to have run through the end of 2020. And that process, which I do want to acknowledge for some of you who may know Laura Roberts, she was the strategic planning consultant for that plan, and she has a lot of depth and experience in the museum field. And so she helped with the involvement of a lot of different stakeholders, as well as the staff and board, to develop a plan that was a new vision and mission for the museum, as well as some big picture goals. And it was also broken down into objectives and actual action steps for each goal. So it was bold and ambitious, but also grounded in kind of steps we could actually take to achieve the goals. So as we were approaching the end of that plan, we were had been planning, the whole course of the plan to start in the beginning of 2020 to develop our next strategic plan for the years that would follow from 21 to 26 or whatever it was. And we had formed a strategic planning committee made up of board and staff. And we were starting to interview consultants, and our goal was to have a new plan in place by December of 2020, and work on the bulk of it over the summer. And I guess I would just say that insofar as we were thinking about the next strategic plan, we were already thinking that we weren't going to do a major overhaul of our mission and vision, that we were kind of on the trajectory we wanted to go on, but that we would be focusing on kind of building capacity and sustainability for implementing the next plan. So that's where we were.
Yeah, and so Rebecca, it sounds like you were finishing out the last year of a strategic plan, thinking that you had some questions you wanted to take on in this next planning process, but the core of the organization, the mission, the theory of change was solid. And yet, before you really got deeply into that planning process, COVID hit. And so you didn't get to start that planning process quite the way you envisioned it. But so we were working under that old, or that strategic plan that was wrapping up. How did that strategic plan help define some of the choices that you made, that your organization made through the spring and summer of 2020?
Well, it was very important. I mean, I think the fact that we just have a very strong sense of who we are and our priorities as stated in the strategic plan, but it was still wasn't like we had to dig it out off of a shelf. I mean, we had been using it all along as a guide for everything we were doing over the 5 years. So it was very top of mind to continue with those same priorities. And I guess, within weeks, we were fortunate. I should have mentioned maybe before that we were very fortunate to have received two fairly large for us multi-year unrestricted grants that they were really going to help us with the next strategic plan, with kind of becoming, building our capacity and taking some risks and so forth. And those funders got in touch with us right away as soon as everything shut down, and basically told us that we should just use them to for our operating needs through the pandemic, and not worry about if we didn't get to the new initiatives right away. So that was a huge help to us in our planning, and that gave us the confidence to make the decision that we wanted to keep our staff employed. Our fiscal year goes through June 30th. So we decided right away that we were able to tell the staff within a couple of weeks that we would keep them on the payroll at least through the end of the fiscal year. We didn't know how long we would be closed. So that was a big decision that was related to what you said about staff being the greatest asset, and staff feature very strongly in our strategic plan as well. I think what other big decisions we made.
You were approached by some folks in the community, Rebecca, you told me, who asked you to take on some new programming. How did you make decisions? Where in the strategic plan were you able to point for taking on some of that work with the schools and in responding to hunger that was pretty prevalent in the community at that time?
Yeah, I mean, actually, as the chronology goes, that happened a little later. That
Oh, okay.
didn't happen till
Then we'll get there. Yeah,
we'll get there.
perfect. So as you're looking at your notes, let's talk a little bit about strategic planning. You guys you started it, you immediately hit pause on it as COVID hit, and then you actually embarked on it over the summer. How did you make that decision to continue strategic planning over the summer of 2020? And how did you change the focus of it in response to what was happening that year?
Sure. And actually, I was trying to think what the other decisions were that we had to make before we resumed our strategic planning. And what we also did last spring was we came up with our entire plan and budget for FY21, which started July 1st. And so we had to make decisions about, reducing our programming for the coming year, moving a lot of our programming online, continuing to find ways to serve the community virtually. We did do some community oriented. We led a group of a partnership in the city of put together some funds for an artist relief fund, and we gave art supplies out to a lot of our community partners who were serving people in their homes so they could take art supplies to people. But also just for the fiscal year 21, we made decisions to drastically reduce our exhibition schedule, to use only our own art that we could hang ourselves, so we didn't have to have things coming and going and people coming and going. And we decided to put up our exhibitions in the fall and leave them up through the whole fiscal year, so that in case we had to close again, which as it turned out we did. And so once we kind of got this planning for the next fiscal year out of the way, and our new fiscal year began in July, we turned our attention back to strategic planning. And we also were able to reopen in July. We were open from July until November, and then we closed again. And we just opened about 2 weeks ago for our second round. We kind of backed into a 2-year bridge plan, which was because we couldn't imagine moving forward without a strategic plan, but we couldn't imagine how we would do a 5-year strategic plan with so much change happening all around us. And so I'm not sure exactly how we landed on the 2 years, but it seemed like enough time to kind of get us through the pandemic and then launch our strategic planning process again. So we, over this summer, worked on, it's really more of an addendum to our original 5-year plan. It's the first, goal of the 2-year addendum is to continue to pursue the goals of the original plan. So that it was kind of like an extension. But we also wanted to add some things that we knew were, new in our lives, or that we would have to do in the coming years, coming 2 years. And so we added a kind of a goal around racial justice and equity, because I didn't mention that, but in preparing for our next strategic plan back in the beginning of 2020, we had already sort of acknowledged that we needed to build that into our strategic plan throughout. I think it had been more of a couple of bullets in the 2016 plan, and we wanted it to be fully integrated throughout the next plan. So we put that as a goal to work on those efforts internally. And I mean, we have done a lot externally, but we needed to work on it more internally with our staff and board. So we put that in, and then we have a couple of things, just tangible things that we had to do in the next 2 years. One is we're coming up for reaccreditation in the American Alliance of Museums. So we knew that we would have to get started on that process. So we added that, and we added our centenary, which we're not sure if we're going to celebrate our founding, when we were founded or when we opened, which are 2 different dates, but they're both in the next 5 years or so. So we figured we better get started on planning for that. So it was kind of a reaffirming of the plan that we already had, and that we wanted to extend it and keep working on it, because there were some things in it we still haven't finished. And as well as adding a few things that we thought were time sensitive to take place over the next 2 years. And then there was, of course, a goal about the second goal after extending the last plan was to kind of get through the pandemic, to just try to stay financially stable, try to, follow all the guidance from state, local, and federal, guidelines, and take care of our staff and our resources, as you pointed out at the beginning. So
wonderful.
that's
Thank
where
you
we
so
were.
much. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Michael, do we have any questions from the audience for either Rebecca or I about the impact of strategic plans on decision making and times of bumpiness?
Yeah, I just see a question here on particularly to Rebecca. What was the role that your consultant played in your process? How were they helpful?
Well, so I mentioned the first strategic plan, and Laura Roberts really led the whole process with Nick. But the 2021, we had not yet landed on who our consultant was going to be for the next 5-year plan. And so the 2-year bridge that we did was kind of more do it yourself with staff and board. It was much more of an internal process. I think, for to do a whole nother 5-year plan, we were going to definitely have the consultant work with us on different ways to include all different kinds of stakeholders, community stakeholders, and we were going to have a much more internal and external process, I think, and we will do that for the next 5 years. But for the 2-year bridge, we kind of did it ourselves.
Great. And one last question here. I know, Rebecca, you're also the development director, so it's your job to raise all of those funds. And so someone says, how do you get funding for strategic planning?
Well, we were fortunate to get a grant from a local foundation back in 2015 or whenever before I was there. They got one. I think, there are certain kind of funders who really like that kind of building capacity aspect to doing strategic planning and how everything else builds from that. And, I think you just have to stay in open communication with your funders and prospective funders, whether it's a foundation or even corporations who really appreciate that kind of work. I can't, I think it just, you have to really believe in it the way we do, how important the strategic planning is and how it's going to get you through the next 5 years. And really a lot of the, work that was done in 2016 to really create a strong identity for us and a strong direction to be more oriented towards the community, and some of the actions that were taken through that plan, becoming a bilingual museum and all the many community partnerships that we have, those attract funders once you can show that you're really living what you've laid out for yourself in your strategic plan. So all I can say is I really recommend doing the strategic planning and sticking with it, because it helps all across the board.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I think I'll add on to what Rebecca said, just to say that, in my experience, you can access funding from organizations that specifically focus their funding on capacity building. There are often capacity building specific funding pools that you can access, of which strategic planning may be one of the capacity building components to your work. The other is that organizations and funders and donors who already love you can often be a source of additional funding for capacity building on top of their support of your general operations or your programming. And so people who love you are a good place to start, as well as some of the specific organizations that focus on capacity building, either within the arts and culture sector or more broadly in the nonprofit sector. So Rebecca, I'd love to ask sort of your final thoughts and takeaways and recommendations that you have for some of your colleagues who may be thinking about embarking on strategic planning. What would be some of those words of wisdom and takeaways that you'd share from your experience at Fitchburg Art Museum?
Sure. Actually, I realized I never circled back to your question earlier about the feeding.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, share a little bit about
that was just something. It's not so tied to strategic. It is, but it. We had the opportunity that one of our funders who loves us came to us and asked us if beyond what we were doing with the Artist Relief Fund and giving art supplies to our community partners, was there something more we could do beyond for just essentially pandemic relief for our community in Fitchburg? Like what could we do? And that this funder was willing to make another grant to support something like that. And so because we're very closely we were in constant communication with the schools through this whole process, because we do typically provide a lot of field trips and other resources for the schools. So we were already in communication with them about some new programming virtual programming we wanted to do with them. And they connected us to a parent support group that had been doing a couple of pandemic relief food distribution events. And they were doing it, with no budget at all, going around getting everything donated. And an infusion of funds really would help them take it to the next level. And so we were able to partner with them and use the museum location, which by that time in the fall, we had already closed again. And so it was really great for us to be able to do something on our site, which was otherwise just locked up tight. And we had food distribution events every other Saturday from December through March. And we're doing a couple more before we wrap it up. We saw it as a kind of a short-term thing specifically related to giving relief during the pandemic. But it tied in with our we have parts of our strategic plan that are about our community and literally our neighborhood, and keep healthy and strong and vibrant. And so it did fit right in with that. And so in case anyone wondered why I had heard, because there was some publicity about it that we were doing food distribution events, but that's how it happened. And that's how we tied it in with our mission as well of partnering with the schools and helping our community. For last words, I think it's really important to think both big picture and big vision and ambitious goals, but also have the kind of action items. Actually, I'm going to put a link to our strategic plan in the chat while the rest of the program is going on. But so you can look at it yourself, but you'll see that there are kind of big picture goals, and then there are specific objectives and action steps under each one. And it's very satisfying. I mean, we used to every year, we still do once a year, the director would pull out the strategic plan and go through and kind of show, highlight the things we had finished in that year. And it's a very satisfying feeling to check things off while still looking at the big picture. So those are my final words.
Well, wonderful. We're so grateful for your time, Rebecca. Thank you so much. We'll watch for that copy of the strategic plan in the chat. So that's Rebecca Wright from the Fitchburg Art Museum. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
A pleasure as well. Take care. And I see a question in the chat a little bit about, whether or not you need a consultant and how much does one cost and how long does it take and how much staff time. Well, we'll chat about that as we go along, and then I'll make sure that I tackle that directly in just a minute. So as you heard from Rebecca, regardless of the path that you took in 2020, your organization has a choice now about the path you take from here, that you take in 2021 and beyond. And when I asked you at the beginning, when you registered for one word to describe strategic planning, it was quite a variation about what your one word was. Some of you described it as daunting and convoluted, and endless, and abstract, and time-consuming, and overwhelming. And boy, that's how you feel about strategic planning. No wonder you don't want to do it. I wouldn't want to do anything that sounded like that either. At that point, I might as well start, cleaning the house and doing laundry, which doesn't sound very exciting either. But I do argue that laundry and cleaning sounds just like daunting, convoluted, endless, abstract, time-consuming, and overwhelming, especially if you have little girls like I do, where every pair of socks does not have a match except its true mate. But the kind of strategic planning that I love, that I think that organizations like Fitchburg Art Museum and Old North are showing with us today are different kinds of strategic planning. They're talking to us about strategic planning processes that feel relevant or successful, vital, that they provide a pathway, focused, excited. And those are other words that some of your colleagues on this call shared with us. So what is the difference? And I'm making an argument in today that the difference is about how you set the process up, and that the success of strategic planning isn't defined by its outcomes in terms of what you list as your goals, but in fact by how you set that process up. And so we're going to talk a bit about those about setting up a successful strategic planning process so that the outcomes that you need for your organization naturally flow from them. So there are 3 stages of strategic planning. It's about getting ready for strategic planning, the strategic planning process itself, and its implementation. We're going to focus a lot today on getting ready for strategic planning, and we'll talk a little bit about the strategic planning process itself, and then the process of implementation. Interestingly, getting ready for strategic planning is probably the most important of these, and everything that flows from that in terms of how the strategic planning process unfolds is a result of the work that you did in getting ready. Just like the implementation years of your strategic plan are the natural onset of the implementing the work that you defined in the strategic plan itself. So there are 4 critical questions to answer when designing a planning process. And these are questions that you can answer on your own as an organization, or you could take on with a strategic planning consultant. So those 4 questions, first and foremost, what questions does this planning process need to answer? Strategic plans are a summary of the answers to the questions that you define, right? It's really easy to download a template from the web that outlines what needs to get included in a strategic plan. But what gets lost when you start with a template like that is that every organization at every moment has different questions. And so Fitchburg Art Museum did strategic planning in 2020. And we're going to hear about Old North launching their work at the end of 2020, and their strategic planning process continues into 2021. But those are two different institutions with different questions at different moments in their time. And what mattered for each of them was being really clear about what questions they had about their today, their questions about their future. So some of the questions that organizations need to figure out are, what are our takeaways from 2020? What did we learn about ourselves, our resiliency, our ability to make decisions? What are kind of our takeaways from 2020? We might have questions as an organization about what matters to us, about our why, the why we exist, and how we capture that in our mission, vision, core values, or theory of change. We may have questions about who we serve or what we offer, how we serve those people, and what impact we want to have. And we might have questions about how we operate and how we fund our work. And it's about naming our questions at this moment in time, recognizing, as we heard from Rebecca, the questions and things that they were wrestling with in 2015 were very different than the questions they were wrestling with in 2020, and are likely to be different questions than Fitchburg Art Museum is wrestling with when they go to do their next strategic plan in 2022. And so it's about naming the questions that your process needs to answer. What do we have? What are our questions about our today, and about our next steps, and about who we are? We also need to name and be really thoughtful about who needs to be involved in this process. It's really easy to sometimes name groups of people, but we need to take that next step and say who needs to be involved and what role should what should their role be? Do we need input from these people? Do we need their buy-in, that there is a strategic planning process, and then buy-in into the emerging conversations and emerging direction, or are they going to be making decisions? And so when we start to make that list of who needs to be involved in our planning process, initially that list includes things like staff and board and volunteers and our members, our donors and our funders and our peers and our partners. But some of these people are not appropriate to be making decisions. Some of these folks we might be looking to provide input, other people we need to bring along as we chart our new direction as an organization and define some of the priorities for the next couple of years. So our second question that we need to answer in that getting ready for strategic planning is who needs to be involved and what role do we need them to have in our process? We also need to think about what information we already have and what information we're going to need to gather during the strategic planning process. So we might be thinking, okay, we have our questions, which we outline. So what do we already have? We might have program data, we might have donor and membership data, we might have financial data, but we're missing information. We have no input right now from our funders and donors. We'd really like to get more information about why our super members love us in return on a regular basis. We'd love to understand why some people lapsed. And so we can think about what the questions are that we originally named, what information we already have, and what those gaps are between what we have and what we need. And that'll help us figure out who we need to get more information from, what specifically we need to learn from them, and how we can get that information during our strategic planning process. So we name our questions that we need this strategic planning process to answer. We think about who needs to be involved and how. We think about what information we already have and that we need to collect during strategic planning. The other thing that we need to figure out up front is how can this process itself help us achieve our goals? How can we make sure that the planning process itself deepens our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? Not that we name as an outcome of the strategic plan that we want to deepen our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so thinking through how does who we involve and how we do it and what questions we take on help us to deepen our commitments and our priorities. And these are all questions that you might ask before you choose a consultant so that you can share with a strategic planning consultant that you've thought through some of these things. And so you might include these in a strategic planning RFP. You might also do them as the first part of your work on your own or with a consultant. But these 4 critical questions to ask even before you schedule the date of your first retreat or your first kickoff meeting. Thinking about what questions our organization have, thinking about who needs to be involved and why and how, what information we already have, and how this process itself can help us to achieve some of our goals. As one of the resources that we have available to you after this webinar, we have 2 worksheets that help you to take on this work. And so one is focused on your reflections on 2020 as an organization, so that you can distribute that to multiple people within your organization and have a moment to step back and say, what did we learn about ourselves and our organization from 2020, and how might that add questions that we want to tackle going forward. In addition, there's a worksheet that helps you to tackle these 4 critical questions for getting ready for strategic planning. Michael, I'm going to just do a check-in to see if anybody has any questions about these, this getting ready phase.
No, I think we're all good.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, if anyone does have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, and you can tell that Michael's watching them quite closely. So we also need to then create a process that's reflective of current COVID guidelines and lessons learned from COVID. And planning in COVID, we need to think about as an organization, how does planning during COVID and the recession impact how and when we plan? In Fitchburg Arts case, they initially were, prior to COVID in January of 2020, they were gung-ho, ready to go on strategic planning. They hit pause as spring really played itself out, and they grappled with the implications of that, and they picked it back up. So they did pick it back up. And so they picked it up in the summer of 2020. So some organizations are moving full speed ahead and right on their original timing. Other organizations are picking when it makes sense within this to embark. We also need to think about how COVID affects how we engage stakeholders. We're already familiar, perhaps way too familiar, with Zoom. And so thinking about how can in-person versus Zoom allow us to engage different stakeholders, and how can we use the benefits of not requiring people to drive to our facility or not requiring in-person communication to better allow us to engage stakeholders. And we can think about how what we've learned in 2020 allows us to make changes to how we plan, so that the changes that we make for planning now and going forward allows us to further our mission, our vision, our core values, and our commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I argue that planning in COVID is actually better. I think we've learned that it's easier to engage stakeholders in a strategic planning process when they might not be local, or they might not be able or willing to commit so much time to drive to a focus group, or some of the other commitments that we took for granted at a different time, to join strategic planning committees that required traveling across the city at rush hour to get to a location, leaving work early, that kind of thing. We've learned a lot about collaborative software over the last year. And some of the things that we've learned from that is that it allows us to more easily work together in meetings to design excellent exercises that allow groups of folks to move very quickly in a way that we weren't doing when our collaboration involved flip chart paper. And it allows for after meeting to move the work forward more quickly. So we can come out of a meeting or come out of a retreat and quickly turn the products around and start using it to drive our work day to day, as well as set up our next conversation. We're finding that Zoom and online is increasing accessibility for participants. Right now, we have the great vaccine disparity, where some people have had access to a vaccine and many across the state still haven't. Those disparities are around both age and health, as well as geographic barriers, as we see that the eastern part of the state has had much greater uptick of the vaccine, in part because of accessibility. It is easier to drive and get to a vaccine that is local to you in eastern Massachusetts. And we know that accessibility means many things. It also means that not all of us have the same risk factors. And so for those of us with kids at home, our families are partially vaccinated right now. So even though we ourselves may have or received the vaccine or be in the queue soon, our children have not yet had access and may not for more than a year. In addition, we're finding that for people who are hard of hearing or otherwise need to be able to tackle some accessibility challenges, we're finding that using online platforms are allowing us to provide more options that we never offered in a routine way in person. We're also finding that scheduling is so much easier when you don't have to take into consideration commute to and from in-person meetings. We're also finding, and we'll talk with Nikki Stewart from the Old North Foundation in a few minutes, we're finding that planning in COVID is also giving organizations a chance to be more creative. Given that everything already feels so topsy-turvy, it makes it easier to think more creatively so that we can build back a better sector and a better organization. And we're not just trying to get back to 2019. So those resources, Sarah from Mass Cultural Council has added to the chat box, and you'll have access to them beyond this meeting as well. We find that scenario planning also helps us in strategic planning to explore big forks. And so figuring out, do we want to include scenario planning? And if so, what scenarios do we need to explore is also part of that upfront getting ready for strategic planning. Strategic planning helps us to explore the potential implications of 2 or more paths. And it allows us to look at the implications of each of those paths on our mission, our vision, the people we serve, our impact on those people, our staffing, our governance, our business model. And it allows us to look at things within your control, like starting something new or growing something, or outside of your control, like opening and closings related to COVID. And I know Rebecca spoke about, they're in their second reopening post, during COVID. And Old North has also been wrestling with opening and closing under some pretty strong restrictions in the city of Boston. So scenario planning allows us to explore changes to our programs, changes to our business model. What I always think of scenario planning as answering a series of what if questions. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? So what if questions around your programs? What if questions around your business model? What if questions are around COVID and the timing of opening, closing, and reopenings? What if questions around the length and depth of the recession, as well as what if questions around when in-person events, in-person activities, and fundraisers will be both possible to be held as well as highly attended, recognizing that those things maybe occur at different times. So I know one of the questions that was asked was, how long does strategic planning take? And I think the answer to that question is, it depends, which is a very consultant answer. But I would say the majority of strategic planning processes last from a few months to 6 to 8 months. It depends the types of questions that the organization's wrestling with and has named early in. And also depends a lot on who needs to be involved and the kind of stakeholder engagement that organization needs at that time. The things that often take a strategic plan into a longer length of time are when you need to do surveys or focus groups of participants or members or donors. Those things are slow. And they take a long time to design, execute, and analyze. And they can take a planning process from a couple of months to more like 6 or a 6-month process and push it out a little bit further. In addition, there's a lot of things that happen both within an organization and outside an organization from a calendar perspective, that can take a planning process and take it from a couple of months to longer. So planning processes that kick off in the fall often, go on hiatus through the traditional winter holidays and through the new year, and then pick back up in earnest in mid-January. And similarly, we can see seasonal slowdowns through the summer, or slowdowns that are unique to your organization around major fundraisers or major programmatic activities. What we're seeing on this slide is a three-stage strategic planning order. And when we embark on the work of this strategic plan, after we've identified all the questions, we figured out who needs to be involved, we figured out what information we have, we figured out how our process can help us, we're going to embark on strategic planning. And strategic planning itself has three phases. One is focused on the strategic and programmatic questions. We start by defining who we are as an organization and why we exist, our mission, vision, theory of change, and our programs. Once those questions are answered, we move on to the second stage of strategic planning, the operational components. And we say, so if this is who we are, and this is why we exist, and this is what we want to be doing, what is it going to take in order for that to come to fruition? What staffing model are we going to need? What governance model are we going to need? What are the implications on our facility? What are the implications on our technology? From there, we get to start to move into the third phase, which is to say, what does this mean from a financial point of view? What is our business model in terms of our money in and money out? What investments are we going to need? Investments might be one-time things like I need a new website, or they might be ongoing things like I need to add another staff position. And of course, from a capitalization perspective, we also need to make sure that our balance sheet is able to support the priorities that we've outlined from a strategic and programmatic as well as operational point of view. Before we head into our next case study, I want to just check in on that question. I know that the question was also asking a little bit about the, whether you need to do a consultant to do a strategic plan. And the answer is no. And some organizations never use a consultant at all. Other organizations go back and forth between using consultants in some strategic plans and others without. And I think that it's really driven by answering some of those core questions about why, what questions you need to answer in this strategic planning process, who needs to be involved. And that allows us to really think about, is this a strategic planning process that we can facilitate ourselves, that we have the experience and expertise to be able to do, or would we benefit from having the expert opinion from the outside about how to design that process, as well as having somebody facilitating it so that staff and board are able to fully participate in it. Michael, do we have any other questions? And did I fully respond to that one that was asking a little bit about timing and the need for consultant?
Yeah, you got that one. We did have a follow-up to that, though.
Yeah.
You talked about stakeholders and getting different people a part of it. What if you are the leader of your organization and you're finding that people just aren't interested in this process? What do you do?
Well, I think I think there's a different answer depending upon who it is who doesn't want to participate. If you have staff and board members who don't want to participate, I think that's a different question than, whether or not we're going to get 100% of our members or our donors to respond to a survey. One of the things I say often is that the people who show up to strategic planning are the exact right people to participate. And so if you care so much about the future of this organization that you want to help shape its future and you want to help its development, then you're the exact right person to be there doing that. And so, when we have staff and board members who are reluctant to participate, often I return to the why. Why are we doing this strategic planning process? What are the questions that our organization needs to answer? And so often those questions aren't really clearly articulated. And when we do, people become excited about embarking on a planning process to answer them. But when you ask people just, do you want to go get your car, have an oil change? Do you want to go to your routine dental cleaning? People don't sound really excited about it. And so when we do strategic planning because we have to, because it feels rote and it's like, oh, well, we do this every few years. It's the same every time. It can feel hard to engage folks around. But when we're really excited about some of these what if questions, if we're really excited about honing in on some of the things that we've been thinking about but not answering, it gives a real reason to take on strategic planning now and to be a part of it.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Wonderful. Well, I think as we bring Nikki Stewart from the Old North Church Foundation on to our webinar this afternoon, it'll give us a chance to talk a little bit about strategic planning because Nikki's in the middle of it. So Nikki, thanks so much for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself and the Old North Foundation?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah, for having me. Thanks, everyone, for joining. My name is Nikki Stewart. I'm the Executive Director of the Old North Foundation. Joined the organization in June of 2020. And the Old North Foundation is the 501c3 that oversees the education, preservation, and tourism operations at the Old North Church and Historic Sites in the North End on the Freedom Trail. We are separate and distinct from the congregation, but there is still an active congregation in the church today. And while the church is nearing its 300th anniversary, the foundation was founded in 1991. So we're a bit younger, but pretty well established and in a good stretch right now. The site closed in March of 2020, of course, when everyone closed. And we made a 2-week run of opening back in July of 2020 when restrictions allowed. But unfortunately, as you can imagine, tourism at that time was almost non-existent, and the numbers were not viable for us to remain open. So we closed the site again, unfortunately had to do a second round of layoffs, and then really set out a work plan of capacity building and kind of back of the house things that we could do in the off season, which included strategic planning, which we began this January. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you tell me, so you were telling us, Nikki, that you came in the summer. Can you tell me why strategic planning was such a top priority for you as a new ED?
Yeah, obviously a great time of transition for the organization in and of itself. And my predecessor had served kind of a complicated role and had been there for quite some time. So it was definitely a time of transition for the organization, but obviously, the world had kind of bottomed out at that point also. The organization did not have a strategic plan in place, and it had been several years since there had been one. And it just felt like if I had asked every single staff and board member some pretty basic questions about the organization and its vision, I got very, disparate answers. And so I felt that a strategic plan was really necessary for us to be able to, come out of the pandemic and be able to have a vision that we were all, rowing toward at the same speed and direction. I think, and we were fortunate to be able to, I would say that was the silver lining of us for closing, is we then had the time and the capacity to do so.
So Nikki, I just argued that one of the most important things in setting up a strategic planning process is to think about the questions that you as an organization needed to answer. What were some of the questions that Old North set out to answer in this current strategic planning process?
Yeah, we had some pretty big questions. First and foremost, in terms of aligning around a vision, there were questions about just the type of organization that we want to be and the type of impact that we want to have. Like, are we a museum? Are we a historic site? Are we an education organization that happens to have a historic site? So I think pretty fundamental questions like that. We also had in 2018, had a really significant business model change in which we went from a donation-based admission to a paid admission model. And so, the organization was just starting to wrestle through, going into the second year of that change when the pandemic hit. So we had really, fundamental questions about our business model as well. Philanthropy historically had been a pretty small piece of the pie for the organization. And I knew that I was hired, in part to make a change in that area. And so, those are the types of things. Aside from how do we stabilize and survive this pandemic, we had really big questions about our future that we would have been asking ourselves otherwise.
You talked a little bit about how you set up the strategic planning process. We should disclose that I'm serving as your strategic planning consultant, but I'm curious about how the organization made a decision to hire a consultant, and how you set up some of your thinking about who would be involved and how the process itself would unfold in order to answer some of those questions you just laid out.
Yeah. So I guess as a little bit of background, I'll say that this is something that I really pushed for. And I knew even before, my first day having met with the board chair that this was something that we'd be doing. And I'm fortunate in that I've seen strategic planning work really well in one of my last organizations. And I would say that strategic plan never hit the shelf. I mean, it was every board meeting, every all staff meeting, every goal that anyone had, everything was tracing back to the strategic plan. So I'd had a good experience in that regard. And therefore I felt that it was worth, as much effort and financial resource as we could put into it. And so my best case scenario was always to have an outside consultant come in and help navigate us through the process. And the other piece is wanting everybody to be able to fully participate. We're down to a staff of 5 right now, and I wanted, all of our staff, including myself, I didn't want to facilitate it because I want to be in the process. And our board is a pretty good mix of longer serving folks and new folks. It felt like if we could get funding for that help, that we would certainly take it. We were fortunate to get the grant to be able to hire Sarah and Paper Crane. And then in looking at who would participate in the committee, we have a committee of 10, which is a little bit bigger than I think either Sarah or I would have hoped for, but it has been a really productive group. I've been able to involve 2 staff members who have been with the organization for a very long time. And so I felt supported by them because, for me at that point, I was 6 months in. And then to have a really good mix of board members, of people who had gone through strategic planning with the organization in the past, people who had substantial experience with other organizations. We really just tried to get a good cross section of skills and experience with Old North.
And we're also being thoughtful during the planning process, not just to use the planning committee, but there's also been a series of staff meetings as well as board conversations as we iterate back and forth, using the strategic planning committee as our core, but involving other groups as well to carry forward some core pieces of the work. Michael, I want to check in to see if anybody's popped some questions for either Nikki or I about how to set up, how to decide to go into strategic planning and how to set a process up.
No questions yet.
All right, wonderful. And feel free to use the Q&A box as folks do have questions. Nikki, what are some of your final thoughts and recommendations and takeaways from having embarked on the strategic planning process that you'd want to share with some of your colleagues in the field?
Yeah, well, I just want to acknowledge that we, in the midst of chaos and misfortune, found ourselves in the fortunate position where our organization wasn't offering services. So we have capacity in that regard, and we did get funding to hire someone. So I know for most folks on the call, that's probably not your actual reality. But I knew that even if we didn't get the grant, that we would have to do something. And so I think there's a lot of importance in just kind of having the mindset where this can be a liberating opportunity. We felt like if business went back to what it had been in 2019, that would be a failure for us. And so, both large and small, like we would be asking ourselves questions about just how we saw the organization as a best case scenario, what would we look like in 2023? I think another reflection that we've had that's somewhat independent of strategic planning is how long of a recovery we should all be planning for. And we actually were able to point to data from some of the earlier MCC surveys about, the real financial loss to the sector across the state, the number of jobs that were lost. We were able to point to a data point saying that organizations like ours should be looking at a 3 to 5 year recovery plan. So it just gave us a lot of opportunity to say, like we're not encumbered by anything that this organization was in 2019. So let's, keep the good stuff, but let's also think about what we're going to stop doing and what we're going to start doing.
And Nikki, I think to be clear, Old North's work continues even while the physical space is closed to visitors. And so while tourism is a big part of your work and visitation is in a normal year, you guys have been doing a fair amount of online programming and other kinds of programming to continue to have impact. It just looks different.
Yeah. But we've been able to schedule it around, the priorities of strategic planning.
Definitely. And I would say that the majority of organizations, COVID has created a very strange time in which some organizations are able to put some parts of their work on hold. At the same time, organizations like Old North did layoffs. So the team carrying the workload is smaller. And so I think that, in most times, organizations continue to lead and do their day-to-day programming and impact on their communities while doing strategic planning. And that's I often think about it as Indiana Jones careening through the jungle, where you're building the railroad tracks right ahead while you're driving the train at the same time. It's really it's a small set of organizations that are able to completely separate strategic planning into a corner and not have it impact day to day and not have day to day impact strategic planning. But I believe that the strength of many organizations is the ability to do both at the same time. The organizations and the leaders are taking what we're doing in strategic planning and using it to make real-time decisions about what to apply for in terms of funding. When a staffing hire is able to be made, based on what we've done so far in strategic planning, how do we now think about the staffing model in real time and start to build for what we're going to be, when we have an opportunity to make a new hire or something like that. So I think it speaks to the expertise and leadership of many organizations and leaders, and being able to do those things in real time together. Any final thoughts, Nikki? I'm grateful for your time, but I want to make sure that we leave with as much experience and wisdom as we can gain.
Yeah, no, I think those are the highlights for us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That's Nikki Stewart from the Old North Foundation. Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks.
All right. So your strategic plan, as we've been talking about this afternoon, is going to guide both 2020 as well as future years. It's going to allow you to stay focused on the most important things to your organization, your why, the kind of impact that you want to be having, your theory of change. You're going to be able to understand whether a decision supports or impedes progress towards your vision and goals. It's going to help you to understand how your business model and capitalization structure sets you up to survive and weather changes. And so that brings us to a question about how do you take a strategic plan and use it to drive decision making? It's great to say it should, but how do you do that? And when we look to the questions that you were asked when registering for this webinar, we asked you if we asked you to talk about decision making in your organization, and some of the answers, really varied. Some of you said your organization is very intentional and effective, and that your decision making is flexible and responsive. But some of you talked about it as being opaque, that decision making was difficult or vague or on the fly, reactive, haphazard. So if we start with this premise that we want your strategic plan to drive decision making, how do we do that? And it's by taking every decision that we need to make and running it through a rubric, a set of questions that allows us to say, does this decision contribute to what the overall organization aims to do? Can we do it exceptionally well? Do we either have that capacity already within our organization, or can we essentially buy that capacity, go and hire somebody who can help us to do it exceptionally well? Is this something we can do in keeping with our core values? Is it something that we can do at scale, and something that the impact can be at scale? Is this something that is worthy of doing at this scale? Do we have the resources available already to do it, or do we need to access additional resources from from outside to be able to embark on this new thing? And these questions are really helpful, because what we find as organizations are implementing a strategic plan, all these things come walking up to them, walking up to organizations under the guise of an opportunity. And those things can be a board member at a board meeting who asks a question, hey, have we ever thought about, to somebody noticing that there are emerging needs in our core audience or an adjacent audience. It could be a partner reaching out, or a partner who stops doing something that maybe you start thinking, oh, maybe we should step in and fill that. It might be a funder or a donor reaching out and saying, hey, would you be willing to, as in the case of Fitchburg Art Museum, to tackle the growing challenges of hunger in our community? And we need a framework through which we can assess those things and figure out whether they are true opportunities that help us to achieve our mission and our vision, that help us to live out our values that we can do well, and help us to recognize when those things are not true, whether they're distractions or they're a Trojan horse that's going to detract from our core work. And I find that in organizations that use their strategic plan to drive decision making, it makes the decision making very clear. And so that organizations don't struggle to figure out, is this an opportunity or is this a Trojan horse? It becomes quite clear which it is. And clarity in decision making for everybody allows decisions to be made and for organizations to keep going. And so in conjunction with these questions, we have as a resource for you to take away from today's webinar, a decision-making tool that asks you these same questions that you can run through as you consider making changes, as you respond to queries and inquiries in real time, both during COVID and the recession and beyond. It allows you to come back to these core questions. Rebecca from Fitchburg Art Museum was talking about how their strategic plan really drove their decision making. And we see that many of the organizations who thrive in 2020 use their strategic plan to do so, rather than feeling like with each one that came up, it was a game of whack-a-mole to figure out, does this fit? Should we, shouldn't we? And there was a lot of time that was being invested in trying to sort through opportunities and Trojan horses and which was which, while trying to run an organization in 2020, which looked a lot like everybody suddenly working from home, having to close our doors, Zoom schooling, and all things that bring many of us to tears when we think about what 2020 looked like. So that resources is in the chat box, thanks to Sarah from MCC, and it will be available after this webinar as well. So your strategic plan is going to help you make decisions, and your strategic plan is going to help guide your work. And both Nikki and Rebecca spoke to that, about how strategic planning guides your work every day, every month, and every year. It helps you to drive progress towards your mission, vision, and goals. Helps to make sure you're doing the most important things. There's always more to do as a staff member, as a board member, as a volunteer, and as an organization every day, every week, and month. But how do you make sure that each of our individual pieces builds up to the collective movement and progress so that we're achieving our mission, our vision, our goals, and our impact? Your strategic plan also gets broken down and used to drive our resources, our allocation of money, our allocation of people, to make sure that we are putting our resources against our priorities so that the most important things get done when we need them to, and in a timely way, and that we have everything in place so that all we have to do is just keep taking the steps that we've outlined in our strategic plan and we get to the end. So at this point, I'd like to invite Michael back to share any questions that have popped into the Q&A. And if folks have any, we welcome you to pop them in right now and share them with us.
Yeah, thank you everyone for hanging on. I know 90 minutes, I'm a strategic planning nerd myself, so I know this is fun for me. 90 minutes on this topic can be a lot for a lot of folks, so thanks for hanging in there with us. I don't see any questions yet, but one of the things I think, Sarah, you brought up, which is great for folks to hear, is this doesn't have to be a huge process. It doesn't have to be inclusive of multiple consultants and, you know, this whole thing. And we've heard from a lot of folks, and I'm glad you brought it up, that because of the stay-at-home restrictions and closures, they were able to have more casual drop-in sessions on Zoom with stakeholders that would have never been able to be a part of the conversation. And it's really easy because you can record it, you can have a transcript of it, you can go back to it and refer to it. So even when we come out of this moment, some of these things might be here for a while, you know, as we go along with that. So thank you for bringing that up. Our own Sarah Glenn just posted in the chat some of the additional workshops that we've got coming up in April. So some of you may know that we've got a series with the Nonprofit Finance Fund around financials, really talking about collaborations and partnerships and some of the economics around that. We've got some basics on financial management. If you are interested in that, we'd be happy to send that to you. I did get one question just came in, Sarah, that I would happy to pass to you. If you don't have a consultant that's working with your organization, who's really the facilitator? Who's the motivating force that is moving this along through the organization?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it allows me to piggyback, Michael, on the comment you just made a few moments ago, which is that, you know, planning processes can be big and small, and organizations need different kinds of planning processes at different points in their own life cycle and their own journey. And so, you know, if you choose not to have a consultant, or you don't have the funds in which to use a consultant, there needs to be a ringleader, a facilitator. And depending upon the organization, sometimes that's the executive director who is leading the process and helping to design the pieces and engage folks in the right conversations at the right point in the planning process. At other points, there's somebody who steps in to serve as the chair of a strategic planning committee. That might be a board member or other volunteer from within your community who serves that. And it's, you know, the principles of strategic planning, as we've talked about them today, are the same regardless of whether or not you use a consultant. It's really thinking about those core questions that the organization needs to answer at this time, thinking about who needs to be involved, and making sure that the way you involve them is in the right way, whether it's input or buy-in or decision making, that you think about what information you already have or need to collect in order to be able to make decisions, and you think about how the process itself can be structured. And that can be done by a consultant or by a team internally. And, you know, during COVID, I led everything from, strategic planning that was, 3 meetings long, to things that were many months long. But it's really about coming back to, well, what do you need, right? There isn't a one size fits all. It's sort of like saying, I have a problem and I'm going to go to to a doctor, what are they going to prescribe? Well, the answer could be anything from 2 ibuprofen to 6 months of PT, but it really depends what the problem is that you're going for. And strategic planning is much of the same. The length of time, the who needs to be involved, all those things are really driven by where your organization is at the moment in time you embark on it, and what you need to answer through that planning process in order to know where your organization is headed over the next few years.
Yeah, and I'd say pretty critical right now. It's one of those things that you may think, oh, we don't have time for that. We're just trying to survive and get through the current moment. Absolutely, 100%. And a lot of folks, their strategic plan is just do what we did last year, but add the COVID protections onto it to make it through. And that's our plan. I think when folks are thinking about re-engaging with the public and rebooting programs, having that outline to kind of understand which programs will go first, which ones that we can allow because of the restrictions that will still be here for a while, and which ones are critical to mission that we have to do, and which ones have a financial implication that we have to really think about as we sort of come back, as we come back to engagement with the public where we were. I think we're right at time. So I want to really say thank you so much, Sarah, and also our two guests, Rebecca and Nikki, for their expertise for today. We really value what you've gone through, particularly Nikki and Rebecca, with your organizations of really sticking through all of this. And I know everyone on the calls is also dealing with all of this, where the funding has just evaporated, and if every dollar counts right now. So we're so happy to have your voices here. This recording will be available tomorrow. You'll get an email from me, so feel free to send it around to anybody that couldn't be here today, whether it's a board member or a staff member or the other organizations that couldn't make it today. We're also going to have Sarah's resources and materials and this presentation along with that as well. So with that in mind, I just want to say have a safe, healthy, and happy rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
Thank you.